Have you ever looked at something ancient and wondered if there was more to it than meets the eye? Today, we're doing just that. We're going to look at 3 ancient festivals, not as just dusty old history, but as a kind of symbolic pattern, a prophetic code almost, hidden in plain sight. Let's dive in.
So here's the big question that kicks this whole thing off. What if an ancient farming calendar was actually a prophecy? What if the cycle of planting and reaping wasn't just about survival, but was intentionally designed to tell a much, much bigger story about humanity's spiritual journey? It feels a bit like we're on a code-breaking mission today.
And here's our roadmap for cracking this code. First, we'll take a look at the ancient calendar itself. Then, we're going to find the key that unlocks the whole thing, the harvests. And after that, we'll decode each harvest, one by one, barley, wheat, and finally grapes, to see what kind of picture it all paints.
Okay, first up, the calendar. In the book of Exodus, the people of Israel were commanded to celebrate 3 huge feasts every single year. Now, these weren't just parties or days off work. They were seen as divine appointments, specific moments set aside to remember and relive the biggest events in their story.
And these 3 festivals were perfectly synced with the seasons. You've got Passover in the spring, which looks back at the Exodus from Egypt. Then in the summer, there's Pentecost, tied to the giving of the law at Sinai. And in the fall, you have Tabernacles, celebrating the building of their sacred dwelling. The idea here is that these feasts have layers of meaning. They're historical, they're personal, and, as we're about to see, maybe they're prophetic too.
So, how in the world do we get from historical holidays to some kind of prophetic code? Well, this is where we find our key. It turns out that each one of these festivals is directly connected to a specific agricultural harvest. And that connection, well, that's what unlocks their deeper symbolic meaning.
All right, this slide right here, this is basically our Rosetta Stone for this whole explainer. Just look at the pattern. You have Passover linked to the barley harvest, which is said to symbolize a first resurrection of, let's say, spiritually mature believers. They're called overcomers. Then Pentecost connects to the wheat, representing a second resurrection of the wider church. And finally, Tabernacles links to the grape harvest, which symbolizes a final judgment. This framework is the key to everything we're about to unpack.
So let's start with that very first harvest, barley. To really get the symbolism, we have to understand the crop itself. What is it about barley that makes it so special in this pattern?
Well, agriculturally speaking, barley is the tough one. It ripens before everything else, and it can handle harsh conditions, drought, heat, you name it, way better than the more delicate wheat. This resilience, and the fact that it matures early, is absolutely central to its prophetic meaning.
And hey, this isn't just something we figured out with modern farming. The Bible itself sets up this timeline. Remember, the plague of hail in Egypt right before the very first Passover. Exodus tells us the barley crop was destroyed precisely because it was already ripe. The wheat, though, it was fine because it ripened later. It's a perfect illustration of the timing.
So, what does this all mean symbolically? Well, the barley harvest is seen as representing the barley company, the very first group of people to reach spiritual maturity. And just like that tough grain, they're seen as these resilient overcomers, an elite group that's ready to face whatever comes their way.
Okay, now let's watch how this pattern develops with the second harvest, wheat, which was gathered right around the time of Pentecost. The key to understanding its symbolism isn't its toughness, but actually a single, really peculiar ingredient used in the festival.
This is it. This is the critical detail. Unlike pretty much all the other offerings, the 2 loaves of wheat bread they presented at Pentecost were specifically supposed to be baked with leaven. Now, in biblical symbolism, leaven, well, it often represents impurity, imperfection, a mix of good and bad. So right away, we know this isn't a symbol of perfection.
So why the leaven? Well, the theological thinking is that the age of Pentecost, what's often called the church age, is seen as a time when believers receive only a pledge, kind of like a down payment, of the Holy Spirit, not its total fullness. And this results in an imperfect, mixed condition, just like leavened bread.
And that's what the wheat harvest comes to symbolize, the general church age. It's seen as an imperfect kingdom, a mixture of good and evil. And because of that impurity, that leaven, this harvest is said to require some kind of judgment, a purification by fire, to separate the good from the bad.
Which brings us to our third and final harvest, the grapes, tied to the Feast of Tabernacles. If barley is about spiritual maturity and wheat is about imperfection, then the grapes, well, they symbolize the most intense form of judgment yet.
Think about it.
Why do you harvest grapes? To make wine. But how do you get juice from a grape? You can't just ask nicely. It takes intense pressure. You put them in a winepress where they are literally trodden underfoot. This severe, crushing action is right at the heart of the symbolism here.
The winepress, then, becomes a powerful symbol for the final, most severe judgment. But according to this interpretation, even this incredibly harsh process isn't without purpose. It's what produces the wine for God's communion table. In this view, nothing is wasted. Even judgment ultimately serves a divine plan.
And this slide just illustrates that escalating intensity perfectly. Each harvest gets processed differently, and each method symbolizes a different level of judgment. The barley is winnowed, the chaff is light, it just blows away in the wind. It's a gentle separation. The wheat has to be threshed. That's a much harsher action, beating the grain to knock it loose. And finally, the grapes must be trodden, the most severe action of them all.
So there you have it. We've kind of unlocked the code. An ancient farming calendar that seems to double as a prophetic timeline of 3 distinct harvests, each with its own meaning and each with its own level of processing, which really just leads to one final big question. If this ancient pattern really is a symbolic plan, what on earth does that mean for us today? Now that is a question worth thinking about.